Thanks, Grace, and thanks for setting up the panel. Thanks to all the panelists and the great audience here. So I'm Robert McDonald, and I'm going to give a little bit of perspective from research libraries. I'm at Indiana University, and we've had a repository for about 15 years in terms of the general type of institutional repository looking at papers. We've been doing data publishing in that for about 10 years or so. And from a research library perspective, I would say a lot of the interest in publishing research data and making it more widely available through our digital library and repository infrastructures really goes back to NSF's Blue Ribbon panel on cyber infrastructure. That's when I started getting involved with it through several different workshops that they were pushing, because it was kind of an extension to what they had funded around digital libraries for quite a bit before that. And a few different programs and projects I wanted to bring up today. I borrowed this slide from a recent one at the Research Data Access and Preservation Conference, and if you don't know that one, I know a lot of the publishers here who are interested in data attend that, sponsor it. It really is kind of the subgenre of research data librarian kind of conference, where they go and talk about best practices, methods, and how they're working to curate and preserve and publish data. And Daniel Johnson gave a talk looking at what's come about in what I would say the historic research library kind of area on this. There's the big report from the Association of College and Research Libraries, which has its own section now around research data management transparency, and the two major spec kits there from the Association of Research Libraries, all that came out in the last 5 to 6 years or so. ARL itself has also been working for quite a bit and having a kind of an annual workshop on research data management. And in my time working both with repositories, digital libraries, because that's a lot of my background, I've seen how this has moved from being kind of its own little niche area to where now it's part of a broader spectrum of scholarly communication advocacy. And that's one of the reasons why in my portfolio now I'm doing scholarly communications for the Bloomington campus, is because some people retired and it shifted around to me because of what I had been doing with research data for a bit already. So those are key things, I would say from the library community to know about. And if you look at the things happening here, this is my fair data principle slide, and we all talked about it, which is great, because if you want to know something, you repeat it three or four times, and we've done that here today. I put that in there because a lot of that came out of a Lorentz workshop in the Netherlands. But another group that I've been working with, and I think this will be a theme I keep coming back to, is libraries as collaborators, is Force 11, because a lot of what kind of became the final FAIR report came out through Force 11, and that's a group I've been working with for about 4 or 5 years as well. And what's so great about that is it's kind of, the early adopters, right? It's the librarians, publishers, researchers who are all, they have a need, so they're an early adopter for one reason or another, to either publish their data or to make it available in some new ways. So it's also a good group to watch where they're going. Much like the Research Data Alliance, it's a really good forum for getting different groups together and collaborating a little bit. So I'm not going to go too much into that, but if you're looking for a place to start, there are 15 principles and 14 metrics for looking at how to share data are really good. And another group, and this is an interesting one, that really the key players around this were at the University of Minnesota and the University of Michigan with their research data and scholarly publishing kinds of programs. They decided to build an alliance or network that would work a lot like open software, where they would share this discipline-specific knowledge for data packaging across many different libraries. And so they've been working on this with the Sloan Foundation for a bit, and their next 3 or 4 years, or it might even be a 6-year plan, is the implementation. So they've done the studies, they've seen that there is enough expertise out there across research data management and libraries so that they can share this, and they're going to hire a full-time coordinator who will actually take entries into their network that need some expertise around packaging, whether it's something about chunking it up for reuse, or how to get it into a repository, or how to best prepare it for a specific disciplinary repository. Because ultimately, I think if you went and talked to the groups of librarians who go to events like Force 11 and RDAP, they'll tell you that that's their first goal, is to get it in the best disciplinary repository for it. And how do you get over that hump of the packaging component and the documenting of the metadata component, all the things that go along with the FAIR data principles. But this is a group worth watching because I know in the coming years, as they start to build that out in practice, it's going to be an interesting way for libraries to get more expertise around the disciplinary element that, as you'll see in my coming slides, I'm going to start with strengths because I like to start with the positive. What libraries have to offer here as a collaborator, and I don't believe that any library can go this alone. At the institutional level, it's usually the vice president for research's office, the library, and IT working together to make this happen. But there is an element of trust in libraries, and a lot of that has to do with just the history of libraries. We've been around a long time. If you look at the places that can actually run a repository and talk about all the principles you need to meet for longevity, libraries usually have a good run of that, even though in this country, they're, the oldest one's Harvard. But as you look toward Europe and other countries, they start going back thousands of years. So you have the longevity, but then the other piece to that is how do you preserve that content? How do you provide descriptive metadata about it? Libraries really good at that. We're really good at a lot of the pieces of access, although there are certain issues with data that come into play there, especially really large data sets. I spent a lot of my career pushing data from different groups, whether it's the HathiTrust Digital Library, whether it's the NSF data nets, and that's still very difficult. In times, it's often easier just to ship the disk still, because unless you've really got the big funding to move it at speed in parallel, it's still very difficult to get it from one place to another, depending on where you are on the network. But again, I want to talk about the advocacy that libraries have, because we're very good at doing that. That's something we like to do, is train. We like to provide sessions. We like to pull in grad students and talk about options that are there for them, what's out there in the discipline, what's available at the university. We're highly centralized at IU. We have lots of resources that are unmetered for both graduate students and faculty. We have a petascale storage facility, which will be upgraded to at least an exascale before we move fully into the cloud. And so we have a lot of great things going on there that will push us forward, that will help us find more partners, both in the publishing community as well as in other areas of research with the funders and with our own research offices. But then you look at the challenges that are there. Like I mentioned, the really big data, that's still an issue. The domain expertise, it's usually limited. As we pull these departments together in research libraries to have research data within a scholarly communications program, usually there's only one full-time research data person, maybe two, and then you're pulling in expertise from the other liaison librarians who are starting to build that on their own as we hire in those different areas, especially ones where data is so important. But we still need that, like with the data network, with the data curation network I mentioned. We also need more alignment with, and I would say expertise in statistical thinking, and thinking about how you do research transparency and how you would provide that kind of training. Although there are definitely groups out there, early adopters, who are doing more than that. And then discovery. Libraries are known, and archivists that I've worked with over the years, they have a different process for how they put data together. Libraries have always been about brute force. When it was the card catalog, you just wanted to have as much information there to guide the person straight to the item that they needed. Since then, we've been using computational power to do that with keyword indexing. We do a really good job of that, but it only scales so far. And in the projects I've worked with, like the HathiTrust Digital Library, and I always tell people this, it's all fun and games till you get past 1 million. And when you get to 16, 20, 30 million items, it gets harder and harder to do that just with a keyword component. So we need better kind of generous discovery interfaces for data. Things like, if you've seen stuff like the AI discovery tool, they're onto something there. I'm not quite sure where that's going yet and how that could be used for data, but it's definitely something that needs to be thought about a little bit more, rather than just brute force keywords like libraries tend to do. And the user interface for reuse, we need a lot of work on that. We've been working on a project for a bit at IU that actually publishes virtual machines from the NSF Exceed cloud-based resource. And we have a few of those, but they're not being reused. In fact, it's easier for someone to recreate their VM and put their own stuff on it and just make a new one, right? So that's where we're seeing with some of that going on, but the opportunity's there, right? So the missing pieces. I mentioned the needing a better discovery interface. That's a given. We need better interfaces for enabling reuse. And domain repositories right now do this really well, especially in certain areas where they're doing a lot of that. So we need to see where that's going. What can we learn there? How can we make that better for things that we do publish as institutions and make it easier to find? And can we do this at the institutional and cross-institutional level? Much like the data curation network of domain expertise, how do we share more of this across institutional boundaries where there are cognates of scientists working in those areas? And there are some good examples of that, but I think it needs to happen more university to university in a lot of ways as well. So that's my perspective today, and we'll get to actual discussion now.
Excellent. Well, I hope that's sparked your curiosity and prompted lots of questions. Before I open up to questions from you, I'd like to pose just one or two general questions to the panel myself. And I said I was, save the good bits for later, so I'm going to stay on challenges for a few minutes. Dina, I was very struck by something that you said about the NIH really understanding that having a policy is not equal to implementation. And so I wonder if I could ask each of you, perhaps Dina starting with you, to just pull out for us some of the challenges that you have encountered in either thinking about developing a policy or in its implementation, and the learnings from that.
Sure. So some of the challenges that we've faced are, for example, investigators not knowing maybe what a data management and sharing plan looks like or how to budget for it. I would say those are two things. So if we do move forward with any sort of new policy, the type of implementation we would have to do to that would be to provide some guidance or specific examples, FAQs, things like that. Other challenges that we're facing would be, if we move forward in that direction, we would need to change some procedures and instructions related to our funding opportunity announcements and things like that. So it's really kind of getting into the weeds related to the details of just all the activities that are related to implementing a policy, and those sorts of details would not be in an actual policy.
Thank you. Robert?
I'll just speak briefly on that angle. I think the stuff that we see coming in from our scholarly communication standpoint are around reviewing those DMPs and trying to match them with the different criteria for the different agencies. Especially a lot lately, we're seeing more with NEH because they've started to get that going. And there's a lot less expertise in some of those areas for dealing with that. But the other side that we're seeing a lot now is more about anonymization best practices for certain things, because in different disciplines it's very different what they would say their best practice is and whether you're meeting it so that you could actually publish the data, and the unintended consequences of combining it with other data and enough compute power to reverse that anonymization. And so we do a lot of work with our HIPAA compliance officer who works across the whole IU system to try to think about that, because there's not it's like the whole thing with the policy versus the practice, that there's no one answer for everybody, and we just have to do the best that we can in order to make it available at the time that we're making it available, and then we may have to revisit that depending on what happens with computation and other data sources. So those are some key issues for us anyway.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of practical issues for authors, at least. I think dealing with private information from studies, that's one of the problems. Finding the right repository, the right sharing mechanism. That's obviously an issue. It's more broadly for authors finding the right repository. I mean, being aware of it. That's very critical. Also, having the right mindset to want to share the data and not just creating a spreadsheet in a PDF that makes it really difficult to actually extract the data for others. I mean, that is one of the challenges. I mean, we can see that it's slightly changing, but it's still not there where we would like it to be. The other challenge is obviously also with the enforcement, making sure that all the relevant data is shared. That also requires recognizing what kind of data needs to be shared. And that's also, we have to rely on the help of the peer reviewers and our academic editors for this, to actually flag issues of data sharing up with us. In some instances, it's fairly easy to see the data is not there. In other instances, it's more intricate to see, and it requires subject expertise. That is the other problem. Also, the quality of the data, the curation, and all of this requires a lot of information and help for authors. So there's a lot of practical issues apart from knowing what we want as a policy, but then also to make sure that it happens and it happens in a way that it's according to the FAIR principles, that everybody can reuse it. And that also requires, I think, an incentive to authors to make the data shared in a way that others can reuse it, and also to recognize that this is actually a good thing, that it can bring them credit, it can bring them citations or other incentives, because if authors recognize the value of data sharing, then they would be also, in some instances, more proactive in doing curating the data in the right way.
Thank you, Jörg, very much. To pick up on that last comment, with two questions. So really, which is about credit and incentives and about making it worth researchers' time and their perception. I think we'd be interested to hear from all of you about your sense of where researchers are in being motivated to share data. How motivated are they? Do they see the benefits? And in your experience, how does that vary between different groups?
Well, I think it varies from field to field. In some fields there's norms where you have to submit certain data to a repository. I mean, one is crystallographic data for structural analysis of molecules. I mean, in those fields it's usually the norm. You have to actually submit the data, and it's not recognized if you don't. So that's the one side. In other areas, that's more like hindrance. People maybe are afraid that they might get scooped if they put out the data. Some areas, I think in astronomy, for example, they have then methods against it. So they have like voluntary embargoes by others for shared data, and these kind of schemes. So it varies quite a lot between discipline. I think you mentioned to me earlier that in some of the life sciences, data sharing is also quite advanced, so it varies.
Okay, thank you.
I was just going to say, in my area, I have a research center, the Data Insight Center at IU, and a lot of the folks working in there are in informatics, so they may be working with another discipline and designing the software to actually do what they're wanting to do in their studies. And the Journal of Open Research Software has been a big boon for them, because basically everything there is like a data paper referencing the software they've created, but then being able to get those citations for those early PhD students in that informatics discipline is really helpful, because they spend a lot of time making sure that experiment works well for the disciplinary person who has their own paper, in their own discipline.
I definitely agree that it's discipline specific, and just to give a positive example, the genomics community, for example, has been used to sharing data amongst themselves for a very, very long time, even before NIH came out with any specific policies for data sharing for genomic data. We have, NIH has a database of genotypes and phenotypes in which we host large-scale genomic data, and we have about maybe 900 data sets in that repository, and probably about 40,000 or so requests have been submitted. Not all those have been approved, but about 40,000 requests have been submitted to access those data, and so that's a success story there. And after we came out with our policies, a lot of the journals also began to have policies for accession numbers for data sets, and so a lot of people have come to the NIH to also submit the data. So I think it's just a positive success story there for how some data can be shared. And a lot of collaborations and consortia have formed as a result of that community being willing to share their data early in the process.
Thank you. So, turning to thinking about, what the positives and what we can do. Clearly, community expectation is one way of providing credit or incentive for researchers to manage and share data. Perhaps you could comment on ways, and you also, I was very interested to hear that you're actually thinking the NIH is considering whether it should include data management plans as part of the peer review evaluation and score, which would certainly incentivize good data practice much further. So perhaps could you tell us what you think are the incentive or credit mechanisms that we should be considering for researchers so that they feel that actually a data citation is, as they tell us in the State of Open Data report, as valuable as an article citation in terms of discoverability, visibility, but also advancing their career?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of thinking, at least within the community and discussions that I've been involved with, that at least having some sort of persistent, unique identifier tagged to the data sets, like a DOI or something would be very helpful. And maybe there could be some linking of those, DOIs with other sorts of IDs, which would allow for the research to be linked to either an investigator or an award or something like that, so that all of the data could be found. If we're able to move forward with what we're considering with a new policy, if that ever comes to light, we would be interested in allowing data management plans to be updatable, because things can change over time and can have different versioning of data sets, and we would at least be able to have included the most recent information on that data set and where it could be found.
Would you like to comment on that, Robert?
I think a good example from IU that we've worked with is the Encyclopedia of Life, a researcher, Franco Pastilli, and he's already taking a look at those unique identifiers and wanting to track how those are used. So that's like an advanced use case, but he's going to build basically this tracking component for how his stuff is reused, and really have a good, I think, argument for the impact that it has in that community that he can pull back in and use in his own, with his lab for his funding and that kind of thing. And we're seeing more interest in that with the kinds of DOIs that we can mint at the institutional level.
Yeah, I think credit via citations is important. I mean, we've seen, at least for some, if you look at some software packages that have been widely used in communities, the papers describing those get thousands of citations, and the authors get the credit they deserve for that. We also need to get into this kind of scheme for data itself. It also means that others can use the data, so the data package may have different authors than the actual paper that uses the data. So there's a lot, I think to demonstrate to the community that this is a good service, and I think over time the uptake probably will increase once sort of also journals are a bit better in implementing data citation to those data packages in the references, that we can quantify and measure those data citations and their use a bit better. All these kind of initiatives. Yeah.
Thank you, Jörg. Okay, I could keep going with my questions, but that seems a bit unfair. I have lots. So I'd like to hand it over to you for questions for the panel. Do we have a microphone for the floor, or do people just need to speak up? Hi. Be helpful if you could say who you are, so that everyone knows, please.
Mike Rossner from Image Data Integrity. A question actually for you about whether you have any information on the other side in your survey of people who have used a data set from a repository that they've gotten out of a repository, not something they've had to contact an author about in their own research.
That's a very excellent question. No, we didn't ask that. I can see Mark Hannell from Figshare is here, and we are very pleased to work with Figshare and Digital Science on the State of Open Data report, which is a survey actually that's ongoing right now, an annual tracking survey. And in that, one of the things that they ask about, or have asked about in previous years, is willingness or frequency of using other people's data sets. But I think asking about actual experience of doing so is a really interesting topic, and if the research isn't out there and we could have a look, then we should think about how we might do that.
I mean, if you can, I think it's key to differentiate people who have reused a data set by contacting an author in the old traditional way and gotten the data set from the author, and to differentiate that from someone who's gotten a data set out of a public repository.
Yeah, really interesting question. I think we had a question, hand up towards the back.
Actually, I do have a question there.
Oh, you stole it, okay.
All right, so I'm in environmental sciences, and a lot of times the data that matters is not the final graph that you see, is the actual the computational files. So are there any plans to have that preserved as opposed to the final output, which is what you see in the paper? So
are you asking about the actual code itself and
in the case, okay, that would be code, okay, but in my case, to be like an Excel file, where you actually compute, where you take raw data from an ICP-MS and then you make it into something more meaningful. That is actually the more precious commodity, not the final output. So are there actually plans, to make that available across the board? Some journals are able to do that, but I don't think it's universal yet.
Well, I mean, Jörg, I could speak from a journal perspective, but Robert probably also has good things to add from an institutional perspective.
I actually worked on an NSF project that looked at water ecology kinds of data like that, and tried some good experiments in taking tools like what you're capturing in an Excel or a CSV kind of file and put it into a semantic component that was run out of the National Center for Supercomputing Applications called Clouder. And it showed some really good potential, but that was the key issue, was there wasn't quite the right community there to want that discipline repository for it. And I think that's what we showed was there's good technology for it if the community is ready to make that shift for the reuse of the components. I haven't worked with that project in about a year and a half, 2 years, because it's kind of moved on in other directions. But there were some great water folks working in engineering out of the University of Illinois that I think are still working on some elements of that. And one of the reasons why I had an AGU paper was because of that. I never thought I would have something there before, but that was related. So I don't have a good answer for that, though.
Thank you.
So, Brooks Hanson, AGU, I have a question primarily for Dina. A comment first, looking at the NIH website for instructions on data policies for grantees, it says it's last updated in 2003. So there's a lot that's happened in the last 15 years, and actually I think NIH was ahead of the curve in 2003. But I worry a little bit that, I guess my comment is that focusing on all the challenges that we have, it kind of leaves the impression that we're waiting for perfection to be the enemy of the good. And there's a lot of really good things that can be done, recognizing that there's always going to be challenges in data sharing. And I think, as Jörg presented, I think the biggest challenge that we have from publishers implementing the policies and making it easier for researchers is getting the researchers to do the right thing early in the process, which really means getting the funders on board to implement data management plans and get that mentality from the get-go. So even if you can't figure out exactly how you're going to evaluate a data management plan or data compliance, saying very strongly that we are going to evaluate them, or that we're expecting data compliance for renewals or for new grants would be really important. So I appreciate all the challenges in doing this, but really hope that the funding agencies can support some of the efforts that the publishers and the repositories are doing without having perfect answers to all of those things. And doing that, I think the funding agencies have a key role in helping us change the culture of data sharing across the sciences. So thanks.
Thank you. Yes, our last kind of general overarching policy is from 2003. As I mentioned in our presentation, we have a lot of other specific policies that have been released since then, but what we're trying to do right now is find a way to broaden and update that overarching policy. And so I would suggest that all of you look for requests for information from the NIH, which we will hopefully be providing some of our thinking on how to move forward, and would appreciate all comments coming in to that.
Thank you. Now, I know Anthony has a question, but he's right at the front. Is there anybody closer to the microphone who has a question on the way?
Should I go or should
Please,
I?
yeah,
Okay.
go ahead. Yeah.
Carolyn Labus from SPIE. Thank you for that last comment. By the way, I thought that was a really good point. Question for the PLOS editor. Can you talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of repositories versus supplemental data and why you might be encouraging authors to use them?
Well, first of all, the supplementary information is tied to a particular paper. It is data that's released by the authors of that paper. Typically, unless it's in a repository, you only can find it if you actually are on the page of the paper itself. If you have a repository, for example, if you have a subject repository, then you will have good curation of the metadata. You know exactly what type of data it is. You have the same type of data in the same repository, or even if it's a general repository like Dryad or Figshare, you can search across all the different data sets fairly easily. You have citation of the data itself, so you have a DOI for the data package itself. Others can take it, can cite it, can work with it. It's not necessarily the same people. It's usually should be in a format that is usable. It generally is also often formats that are more widely. So some repositories accept things like Jupyter notebooks, which just goes back to the more interactive kind of data tools and sharing tools. Not all journals do, or many journals don't. There's a lot of advantages in going to repositories, from my perspective. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think there was one more, and then I'll come to Anthony.
Thank you. Daniel Hurley, Sage. My question was around, is there for data citation some way of establishing recognition, like a version of impact factor?
Ooh, the impact factor words. Ooh. Yeah, do you want to take that one?
Not on the impact factor, but at PLOS we don't believe in the impact factor. So yes, data citations. Yeah, absolutely. I think this is going to be critical, and it's not just for data itself that's in repositories. It should be the same also for software, for example. I think the trend is going to have the different components of research, giving authors credit if they share different aspects of their work. There are obviously DataCite and other institutions. There are efforts to kind of standardize the process, to collect these kind of citations, and then yes, obviously people can also count them, look at them, and analyze them.
So you could end up with an H index, which is an individual researcher score based on data citations rather than publications.
Or it goes into the kind of alternative metrics of a paper, like send to downloads, page views, citations. Then you can also add the data citations on whatever.
And it's great to see those metrics and those download data available on. We work very closely with Figshare, so I've been watching very closely the metrics of the white paper that's in there, and being able to see the altmetric score, but also the downloads and the citations in real time is brilliant.
Can
Mark?
I follow up on that?
Hi.
Hi, Amy Forrester from Data One. For the publishers, where does requiring data citations fall in your data policy plans? So it is going to be super important, and trying to figure out how we're reusing it and if we are, but one of the main ways is going to be by citing it, and so where does that sit in your policies for actually requiring that in your submissions?
Well, we do require it as part of the data availability statement. It should also be in the reference list. The initiative that I described, that's chaired by the AGU, is also looking exactly into this. The data should be cited as part of the references too. So it falls into kind of the aims that we're aiming for.
I agree with all of that. I think in terms of practically where Springer Nature is at, we have a large number of journals that are now requiring data to be, at least the data that's referenced in that research article, to be cited. and to say where data are available. The majority of our journals actively encourage that, and over time we want to move more and more journals to requiring, but we need to be aware of community norms and move as fast as we can, and push that a little bit, but respecting the fact that some communities are at different stages, subject communities are at different stages in terms of data sharing and data referencing. Okay, we have 5 minutes, so we have, I'm going to take these 3 questions and then I think we'll have to close.
Hi, Malavika from Portland Press of the Biochemical Society. I have, just following up on exactly this piece, I have a question then about what does, on the journal perspective, the checking mechanism, if any, look like when you're evaluating, say, the data availability statements or the fact that the data citation should be in the reference list? Is that built into the workflow? Is it assumed that the journal requires it and so authors will do it, and who's looking for it?
Yeah, do you want to start?
For us, we have, upon submission, we have staff, journal staff that looks into that. Obviously, they're not subject experts, that's what I said. So it's a tandem of, you have journal staff looking at the statement and see that everything there looks okay. But at the same time, you also need subject experts, either reviewers or editors, who also need to take their responsibility. And some of the instances where maybe, papers do get published where not all data is maybe available or as it should be. And that is usually, then that comes down to kind of the different aspects in part of one of that process not failing. But it needs different parties need to check on that. Yeah.
Springer Nature, our experience is similar. So we have some journals where they actively, what we found is basically you need to check. And there's a difference, and you need to do a quality control check. And there's a difference between that binary yes, no, is there a data availability statement present, and the time and effort and efficacy of that, and making sure that that data availability statement or accessibility statement is actually useful in terms of the link resolves, what the information is in there, providing templates, but also then copy editing that. Some of my colleagues have a preprint on bioRxiv that actually looks at the results of a study in terms of the time that those different options actually took. And by the time we were at 20 journals, those that were just checking yes, no, is there a statement, it added about 4 minutes per manuscript to the editor's work. Where data sharing was required, so there had to be a data availability statement and the data had to be shared, and where they were shared had to be stated. In the end, that was, I think from memory, somewhere around between 12 and 15 minutes, the additional work required per manuscript. And that's before you get into curating the metadata or doing any other kind of review checks on the data itself. Great question. Anthony, you have the final question for your patience.
She gave it to me. Don't blame her. Okay. Anthony Watkinson, Cyber Research. I've been immersed in interviewing early career researchers in the last few months. But one thing I can say in general is that they are keen on sharing. There's no question of that. It's part of their DNA, you might say. Secondly, they tend to do silly things like putting the data into supplementary materials or that sort of thing. You know, they're not thinking through what were the best thing to do. But to go back a step, it seems to me that on the whole, the research they're doing, the PIs are not thinking at the beginning of the process how they're going to conform the research so they get reusable data out of it. I mean, this may be obvious to all of you, but I don't know what we do. How can education be done and by whom to get people? And bearing in mind, you see, the older people are used to the idea of hanging on to their data until they've exhausted it. They're not thinking in terms of sharing, really. Okay? That's the starting point.
It's a great question, Anthony. Thank you. And I have all sorts of opinions on that, but I'm going to try and be a good moderator and invite my colleagues to comment.
I was just going to make a quick comment. One thing we're trying is to get in with the Vice President for Research's office when they do the kind of, I'm setting up my lab kind of class that they do in the summer before the new people start, to talk about the services we have available both in IT libraries and elsewhere to get them thinking about that option. But, you know, we pushed and pushed and pushed to get like 20 minutes, right? So, because everybody wants to know how they pay the bill for this and how they do, you know, all the other things of running a lab. So that's where the real challenge is, right?
I was going to say, this is why many of the funders are trying to push with requiring data management and sharing plans, because data management and sharing is a part of the scientific process, and if those plans are required early on, it'll really have the investigators to think about what it is that they're going to do with the data that they're generating and how they're going to make it available up front.
I think ultimately it comes back to what's in it for the researcher. So if they're an early career researcher, how is it going to advance their career, and putting it in terms that shows the benefits. And then, you know, if you're trying to get your next grant, then making, not only using that as an opportunity perhaps to provide education and resources, but also policy that makes that a prerequisite, I think is important too. Thank you very much. What an excellent group of questions. Thank you very much for bearing with us. I'd like to say thank you to our speakers.
And to you.
Thank you, Anthony. Enjoy your lunch. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.